Energy Switch is the popular point-counterpoint show where two leading experts with different perspectives discuss the most pressing energy and climate issues in the news today. Next on Energy Switch, we'll look at policies to reduce carbon emissions, including taxes, incentives, and standards.
Funding for Energy Switch was provided in part by Microsoft and the University of Texas at Austin.
There have been many policies proposed to reduce CO2 emissions. A tax on carbon emitted or embodied in products. A cap on emissions, with emissions permits that could be traded. Subsidies for lower emission energies. And carbon emission and efficiency standards. Each have their pros and cons, and we'll talk about them all with my expert guests. Dr. William Pizer is a Harvard-trained economist and the Vice President for Research and Policy Engagement at Resources for the Future.
You're starting with trying to encourage lower carbon emitting technologies without discouraging the product itself. You're not getting into whether steel is good or bad because of the carbon that's in it. You're trying to encourage the steel manufacturers to produce with less carbon. All of these sectors where you're trying to encourage new technologies, potentially you're going to take more jobs to do it.
Joining him is Sasha Mackler is the director of the Energy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank. He studies energy policy and markets.
Carbon pricing is politically hard, and we need political buy-in to get started so we have enduring policies that are durable across changes in administration. So instead of focusing on what's the right price, I think really we should be focusing on what's our goal.
I'm Scott Tinker, and I'm an energy scientist. On this episode of Energy Switch, policies to reduce CO2 emissions. Let's jump right in. Let's start with carbon tax. What are the benefits of that approach?
The arguments for a carbon tax are that you have all of these different places throughout the economy where you can reduce emissions. You can drive your car less, you can use cleaner fuels, you can install an energy-efficient air conditioner. A carbon tax is the only policy that simultaneously encourages every single activity to reduce emissions, wherever it is, efficiently. And that has the advantage of getting the cheapest reductions wherever they occur. It does have the disadvantage of potentially being horribly inequitable. But in terms of economic efficiency, it's the thing that does it the best.
Right. So pricing CO2 is obviously a pretty big deal. How do we do it? How do we calculate a price on CO2?
It basically comes down to this. You figure out what the temperature change, or what the weather change and the climate change is going to happen from climate models based on increasing emissions. You turn those things into impacts, the storms, the wildfires, all that sort of stuff, and then you value it.
This isn't just an academic exercise, right? I mean, this is how, for example, the Environmental Protection Agency looks at ways in which to design regulations and how far to go, right?
That's totally true. Every regulation in the United States, at least at the federal level, of a certain size has to go through an analysis to say, do the benefits outweigh the costs? And so this number becomes really important, how we value the benefits. And so we have to figure out ways that we can encourage the emission reductions that may cost $100 a ton, but without charging consumers $100 a ton in the process.
Yeah. Before we start talking about mechanisms, what's a reasonable price?
You mean a price
on carbon
to charge a tax, or do you mean a price to use to value and make decisions? Well, I think the right number to use to make decisions is probably on the order of $100 a ton. I mean, that's I think where the evidence is going to lead us.
And that's global?
That is based on global benefits.
Okay.
So that you have put your finger on a very sensitive issue, which is when we talk about our efforts to reduce emissions here in the United States, how do we think about the fact that everybody in the world shares in those benefits? Mm-hmm. And you think about the U.S. economy as 25% of the world, so maybe we get 25% of those benefits. Should we really be counting those benefits if most of them are occurring outside the country?
How does a carbon tax capture that price, whatever that price is? Let's just say it's $100 for. How does the tax capture that price?
Well, so it would be reflected in the product in some way, that whatever you're buying, whether it's a gallon of gasoline, $1 a ton of CO2 would be about a penny a gallon, and so it would just flow through to the consumer. It could be embedded in the energy that has gone into making a ton of steel. And so that steel price will, so it'll be in the products.
But it's not $1 a ton, it's $100 a ton, so that's $1 a gallon on top of $3 or whatever it is today or something like that. So is that kind of the range, 20-25% on things? If we go to that $100 range, we're going to see things go up?
I think it's the right range for gasoline, but there aren't that many things that are quite as carbon intensive or emission intensive as gasoline. So the effect on electricity would be less.
The political reality that waiting for a policy that brings us to $100 per ton in some explicit form from a policy perspective is really not the smartest thing to be doing, because carbon pricing is politically hard, and we need political buy-in to get started so we have enduring policies that are durable across changes in administration. So instead of focusing on what's the right price, I think really we should be focusing on what's our goal from either an emissions perspective or an energy mix perspective, and then be kind of walking back from that.
But again, I would just caution, I don't think Sasha, I think we're going to do $100 a ton anytime soon.
Yeah, no, that's sort of the analytical number. But when you think about sort of how that filters through to what's possible or probably what's the right place to start, it's probably much lower.
Let's talk about cap and trade a little bit. Different approach. How does that look instead of a carbon tax?
The big difference between a cap and a tax is really, with a tax, you set the price that you're willing to pay on any sort of, on what you want to reduce, like, for example, carbon emissions. With a cap, you set the level of the emissions that you're willing to tolerate, and you let the price kind of fluctuate. Those are the core differences. We have a successful track record of running environmental market-based cap and trade systems in this country through the Environmental Protection Agency. I actually used to work there in the Clean Air Markets Division of the EPA, where we were setting up sulfur dioxide trading programs, nitrous dioxide trading programs, and they've worked very well in smaller, sort of much more contained markets like utility power regulations, really coal plants, for example. There was a whole push for an economy-wide cap and trade program about a decade ago, which didn't gain traction and really hasn't come back.
Is it a scale challenge? I mean, why has it sort of faded?
It is a scale challenge in the sense that, covering the whole economy, it's just a lot of entities to regulate in some way.
One of the great things about both of these programs, whether it's a tax or a cap and trade, as long as it's technology neutral and it doesn't say you have to do a particular thing, people will find cheaper ways to do everything.
Really
let the markets compete.
Let the markets compete. And so I think that's one of the most important messages.
And it gets back to the entrepreneurial nature of finding the right solutions, giving people the right signals, and then letting our entrepreneurs and our business community pursue.
So the unintended consequences of perhaps going down the tax road or the cap and trade or some other mechanism are what?
I'd say there are intended consequences that you raise the price of fuels and products in a way that makes it more transparent and politically more difficult and creates a massive amount of redistribution. I mean, if you were doing a $50 a ton tax and you were creating a couple $100 billion in revenue in the process, you've got hundreds of billions of dollars of transfers from the people who are paying for the tax to the government, who will then do something with it, maybe give it back to them, but not back to exactly the people who had the higher costs. And it's that additional redistribution and very visible cost that I think creates a political liability.
Isn't it a consumer issue more than the producer issue? I mean, we want all this stuff. Shouldn't we pay if we consume more for the taxes? Why should the people making the energy that we're demanding pay? Why shouldn't we pay on the consuming end?
Certainly, the economists would say, you should make them pay, so they'll figure out ways to reduce their fuel use. But I think, politically, it's just very unpopular. The other dimension is the trade, right? Yeah. So if you do a very transparent carbon price, you raise the price of all of our products, and that creates even more trade problems.
What if it doesn't happen, Billy, globally then? We put these prices on in Europe and the US, and it's 25 years before those who are producing the most emissions today say, we might get there. So what's the unintended consequence of that?
Well, it would be our carbon-intensive industries would relocate to these less regulated jurisdictions.
Right.
So the only way it really works at some point, regardless of what policy you use, is to have some sort of trade mechanism.
At that border.
At that border.
Yeah.
And it can actually be an incentive to get people to take action, where the people who are taking action have agreed that we're going to price stuff at the border from all the countries that are not.
My question is, if some of us put border taxes on, and the country producing the stuff has to pay the border tax, right?
Yeah.
But they have a different market to sell their stuff, and they send it to the emerging and developing markets.
I think a point that you're making, which I really agree with, is that this is going to be messy. It's going to be very messy. It's going to take time. And we shouldn't judge success or failure as, really, are we, by the metric of, are we able to get everybody to do the same thing on day one? This is going to be...
So in a transparency sense, we need to say what you just said. It's going to take time. It's going to be messy. There are going to be costs. We have to adapt.
People, I think, trot out carbon tax as kind of a boogeyman, to scare people that we're going to go out there and suggest $100 a ton.
Right, that scares me.
Tax. I think it scared you. It scared me. It scared anybody listening.
Right.
I don't think anybody thinks that we ought to have a carbon tax as the main policy. Anybody who's serious about solving climate change is proposing a carbon tax to be the main policy.
Also, I think if we put this into some historical context, a decade ago or more, there were a number of proposals on the table to price carbon, either through a tax or through a cap and trade program, which would have had a price. And then we've been working on those ideas, since then, and nothing has been implemented. We haven't made the sale on that policy mechanism. So
it's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Politically tough.
Politically difficult. It's
Public
really
doesn't like it.
It's unpopular. And so I think as we think about carbon pricing, we should think about it as something that we will probably eventually need, but maybe we don't need to start with carbon pricing. We should start with the things that we know have worked. And
what are those? So what do we do?
So what we've been doing up to now, which has had actually a great deal of success on certain things like solar and wind, bringing down the cost, is we've been using incentives and subsidies. And we've also been creating policy mechanisms at the state level that require certain amounts of renewable energy to come into the system. That has actually proven both popular and effective. So why don't we take those proven tools and scale them up at the federal level?
So like a renewable portfolio standard at the states. I think kinds of structures.
Something like that, but maybe we should broaden it to be a little bit more than renewable and to focus on clean, on carbon-free energy. That would include carbon capture, would include nuclear as well as wind and solar.
Geothermal, hydrogen. If you're not emitting and you can compete on price, you're in. You get some incentives.
Then you're in. That would be a very productive place to start, and that's something we're really working on at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Yeah, just to put a point on it, what you want to do is you want to take every sector, electricity, transportation, whatever, and you want to say, what do you produce? You produce electricity. Okay, we need to lower the carbon per megawatt hour. And we're going to give you a standard. You figure out, you industry as a whole, how you're going to do it cheapest. You give them that standard, you give them flexibility, they figure it out and they do it at the lowest cost. And you don't have to pick the winner, you don't have to pick...
you don't have to pick the price.
You don't have to pick the price, you just give them the standard. So, you're basically, setting up what would be called a carbon performance standard.
Then do it and compete. Because that moves us down the road before we get stuck and mired in a tax or a cap and trade, which goes down like a poison pill.
A poison pill or a lead balloon. But these flexible policies can put a price on carbon, but they're not being passed on to the consumers the way a tax would. So, you have a low carbon fuel standard for fuels that may have a fairly high price, but it's not raising the price of gasoline, by $1 or anything like that. And so I think those are the kinds of flexible sectoral policies that could be really effective.
Number one, of them being more popular so we can actually get moving. Number two, they bring down the costs of dealing with climate over time so that if we eventually realize, which I expect that we will need to have a more economy-wide or even global system to manage CO2 at some point, we've already been on our way, and it reduces the cost of that policy when we turn to it.
And we've developed technologies.
We've developed the technologies.
Have the economies of scale and
exactly because one of the shortcomings of something like a carbon price or tax is that it doesn't really help so much with the technology development side of things. We need complementary policies there to bring those forward.
So instead of a tax or a cap, is it more affordable, effective to directly encourage these CO2 reductions?
Yeah, I think so, because you're starting with trying to encourage cleaner technologies or lower carbon emitting technologies without discouraging the product itself. So you're not getting into whether steel is good or bad because of the carbon that's in it, you're trying to encourage the steel manufacturers to produce with less carbon.
Right. You might even add some jobs as you bolt something else on, and the steel jobs don't go away.
That's right. That's right. So I think all of these sectors where you're trying to encourage new technologies, potentially you're going to take more jobs to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
subsidies. We mentioned them before for solar and wind and other things. Who pays for that? How does it get translated?
Well, so it really depends. It depends on the subsidy. If it's in the tax code, which is how we've done a lot of our incentive structuring up to now for wind and solar and other technologies, that's the federal taxpayer that pays. It's all of us.
Everybody pays.
Everybody pays.
And there's downsides to that. If I make less money.
So there are downsides, but there are also upsides. It's less regressive. It has less of an impact on the poorer populations because it's spread more broadly. The other, I think, big challenge with subsidies is that we can't subsidize our way to a net zero future. It really, because of the amount of infrastructure that's needed to be built and the scale of the energy system, we really need to have the private sector and the business community and the markets themselves see this as their way of doing business.
You don't want the government to be subsidizing everything. You want to set the rules of the road for the industries and kind of unlock their efforts.
Isn't it true if I strap a 8-kilowatt solar panel system on my house and charge the Tesla in my garage and put the Powerwall in my house, I can afford that, and it's subsidized. Mm-hmm. A lot of people that can't afford that, aren't they paying for my Tesla? Isn't that a little regressive?
There's an equity part of that I think really does need more scrutiny. Because
as you start taking the subsidies away, then it gets to the point where the people who need it the most don't get a subsidy, right?
Well, they don't get the subsidy, but they're also paying for you to enhance the quality of your life or the value of your home. So, that's a dimension of energy and climate policy that, in the environmental justice component of how we design policy has really been underthought.
We get, wealthy people who are contributing to technology development. But I think what's happened is we've gotten to this point where it is actually a net benefit, and it's really benefiting the wealthy.
Yeah.
And so we have to rethink some of those dimensions.
Policy has to. Incentives
Policy has to
end.
evolve. It has to evolve. Right. I think that's a real theme here. We need to be able to learn and adapt as we move ahead. And there's also, it's very important, I think, to recognize that if we're going to innovate and innovate quickly, we need to actually accept some failures. Yeah. Failures technologically and failures from a policy perspective, and then we need to learn.
Yep, absolutely. So now renewable standards or power purchase plans and other things like that, those tools, who pays for those and how have they worked?
The renewable standards basically are being paid for by ratepayers, ultimately, who have to pay slightly more for their electricity in order for the local utility to buy the renewable energy credits that then become a subsidy to the renewable sources. It's a way of kind of internalizing the cost of that subsidy within the ratepayer base. But the thing to think about with renewable subsidies, as we talked about a couple of times, is they're targeted on a couple of technologies, not necessarily all the carbon-reducing technologies, and they don't do anything to try to encourage cleaner fossil technology or cleaner carbon-emitting technologies.
Right.
So, I think rethinking those sorts of policies with an eye on carbon emissions could be quite powerful.
Is it happening? Are we seeing it start to happen, or is there still just a giant push away from the fuels?
There's always been talk about some sort of national clean electricity or carbon performance standard, but I don't think it's caught on too much, or it hasn't.
Well, this is something that I spent a lot of time working on at the Bipartisan Policy Center. It really does need to now expand to moving beyond just wind and solar to other clean sources that we know we're going to need if we're going to have a deeply decarbonized power sector. This is really a policy mechanism for electricity alone. We should expand it so we can bring in more technologies. And we should think about ways in which we can expand the politics, the supporters of those different technologies and of those different regions of the country, so we can start to get moving on the federal level. And we are starting to see that. There's a bipartisan bill in Congress right now that has a Republican and a Democrat that are putting together a clean electricity standard for the federal government, and there's increasing momentum, although I wouldn't say we're there yet politically.
So what have been the unintended consequences of these kinds of purchase plans and standards, mostly in the States? Have there been anything you say, oops, I'd change that, fix it when we go federally?
Well, I think, focusing only on wind and solar, I think that's an unintended consequence, as we haven't necessarily cultivated the other technologies as much. And in some cases, we are letting some of our most important clean energy generating resources fall out of the system, which is just digging a deeper hole for ourselves. And I'm referring to our existing nuclear fleet when I say that. That's a lesson. We can't let those clean, safe, and very affordable, actually, power stations go away if we're actually going to try to be successful in taking all the carbon out of our system in time.
One thing about the performance standards, the fact they don't differentiate between technologies is a plus and a minus, right? Because on the one hand, it's not limiting you, but on the other hand, it's not thinking about, what are the incumbent technologies and what are the, the new cutting edge technologies that may need more time. So, I think it's important to realize that, there's not a silver bullet here.
Right.
You need a package of policies, but you're going to need other policies that kind of bring, the newer promising technologies to market.
Right. Yeah, sure. There's no silver bullet from a policy perspective, and there's no silver bullet from a technology perspective. We really do need to be really working at multiple levels here to get this this transition underway.
You've mentioned nuclear, hydrogen, CCUS. We've talked about solar and wind as sources. Switching just from coal to gas, it doesn't get you all the way there, but you can make a pretty quick transition to lower emissions if you're able to do that. Some big levers. And those should have a fairly reasonable path because of the time frames.
There's almost like three things you could think about. There's getting the technologies that we have ready deployed. So, getting more renewables and nuclear and whatever CCS is feasible in the near term. There's the very short term, easy stuff that you mentioned, like the switching, from coal to gas, which isn't really about a new technology deployment. It's about redistributing what we have in some sense. And then there's the longer term, technology investments.
And what you really need is bipartisan political will. That's probably the most important thing of all, to get this transition underway and to take us through all the way to its success. Because the amount of capital that needs to be invested into this transition is trillions of dollars. And companies, I think, are reluctant to bet their business on a one-party agenda that could change every 2 to 4 years. And so
it does.
And so we really need bipartisan agreement so we can get started.
There's another big wedge we haven't talked about, and that's just doing more with less. Efficiency. We consume so much energy in wealthy nations. But it's hard to motivate that. How do we get efficiency just translated into the economy? What are the strategies here?
I think you're really thinking about households and consumers who may not really be constantly trying to get everything they can out of everything. The evidence is pretty compelling that it seems like people are not paying attention and they're missing opportunities. And a lot of the talk we had earlier about carbon taxes, part of the reason you want a carbon tax is to encourage consumers to do those sorts of things.
Right, the stick.
Yeah, the stick, to raise the price of gasoline, to raise the price of electricity, get them to use less. And in some sense, the whole efficiency argument is based on them doing that. And yet there's very little evidence that that's true.
Right.
So I think that that's the reason we turn to other policies where we set efficiency standards. That's been the approach that we've had for buildings, for appliances, for automobiles. Most energy-using consumer devices are regulated, one way or the other, because of this problem.
But I think it's important to recognize we're never going to conserve our way through the climate problem.
Right.
It really is too big for that.
It's a wedge.
It's really, if you look at the economics of things that we can be doing, it's usually the most cost-effective thing to be doing. So we should be doing it first across all of these different applications and sectors.
I would also just add that, it is hard. I mean, if you've ever tried to find somebody to do the work on your house that's, a quality person who knows what they're doing, knows your house well enough to know how to do it, it gets hard. So part of this is a little bit about scale, that, doing every house and, even
the transaction
the transaction costs get higher.
Are high.
So I
That's
think
true.
Sometimes people look at these things and they say it's low-hanging fruit, and they kind of forget these transaction costs and frictions that happen for the homeowner. And we've thought about it at RFF. I mean, I'm not totally sure this is going to be this may be one of the last places we actually go.
At the home level.
At the retrofitting homes.
Interesting.
We talked about a carbon tax to put a price on CO2 emissions, and cap and trade, which sets a limit, not a price. But both of these are unpopular and politically difficult. Some countries have adopted one or the other. The U.S. most likely won't anytime soon. Instead, we could broaden subsidies and incentives at the federal level to include all energies that can reduce CO2 emissions. And we could try to adopt low-carbon performance standards. While these costs are less transparent to the consumer, we still bear them. So we need them to be equitable. And we'd need bipartisan support for these policies, or they won't happen.
Energy Switch is executive produced by Scott Tinker and produced and directed by Harry Lynch. Sophie Byard is the assistant producer and researcher. Editors are Ginny Patrick, Yusuf Swachina, and Jackie Kunzler. Matt Aslanian does the sound. Energy Switch is produced by Arcos Films for the Switch Energy Alliance with support from Microsoft and the University of Texas at Austin.